Today's conversation is really very, very interesting for me because it's something I've been following, especially as a Pan-Africanist, but not only as a Pan-Africanist, but also as someone who believes in arts and culture. The conversation today is approaches towards the restitution of African cultural properties from colonial times.
In 2017, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, in his speech at the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, made the official commitment to return the stolen African art from France. Two countries have been selected to be among the first ones to receive back their cultural properties, Senegal and Benin. Similarly, a growing number of European states as well as cultural institutions are now moving forward towards launching such restitution processes. While the general idea of the return of stolen works is well received, the practicalities of this return are more debatable. A central issue is that of the conservation of returned works in terms of means and preservation. The term restitution in its conceptual framework is indeed in itself problematic because it is museum-centric. For instance, the restitution debate remains at a state level, even though the art objects in question were produced and used at different levels of society. While these objects can be considered as being part of humanity heritage, the question of ownership of these objects is central. The restitution of cultural properties, therefore, opens up a number of questions which tackle the history, memory, and decolonization of knowledge altogether. The process also paves the way to the redefinition of the Africa-Europe relationship with a stronger commitment towards the reimagining of a post-colonial relational ethic. So, how can we envision the restitution of cultural properties as a step towards the development of an African way to look at conservation?
So, decades of years back, we had the colonialists, or people who actually came into our continent, pillaged, became superiors, they told us we're inferior, and so they admired some of our things. And when they admired, they said, we're taking these things because we think these are very amazing things that our people should actually interact with. And so our people then, because, I don't know, maybe the panel elaborate more on what happened. These things are actually seated comfortably in a lot of institutions outside the continent and outside different places within the places where they were taken. Now, today, of course, there's been a lot of conversation, not just today, but even earlier before, about people trying to say, we need these things because they mean a lot to us. And these things have been very much misrepresented in institutions like museums and different various cultural institutions. Understanding this history, the French president at some point actually acknowledged the fact that these things, and not just the French president, but a lot of other leaders within the space have acknowledged that these things are in their institutions and they need to get back. However, some of the institutions, or actually, I don't know what is actually delaying the process, have insisted that these things can actually remain with us, and the panelists will give us more reasons as to why, or what they think about them. And for those of you who are listening and would like to get your opinions, but let me start with you, Balimonsi. As the curator, UNCC, and also Nomo Gallery, I know you interact very much with collections and art pieces and all this. But for someone who's listening to this conversation, they're probably asking themselves, what is restitution? What is repatriation? What is decolonizing the museum or decolonizing institutions I'd like you to give us sort of like an overview or background of this conversation so you can set the pace.
Well, thank you so much. It's a privilege for us to have such a structured encounter and discourse on matters that pertain our souls. When we talk about objects, before we even think repatriation or restitution, we are talking about memories. We are talking about identity. We are talking about a definition of who we are as a people. We are talking about the memories that we hold on to define ourselves as Africans and as Ugandans. Now, when we go to repatriation, talks much or looks much into what we can call cultural diplomacy, where you have a state demanding particular collections or objects that belong to its nation. But when we look at restitution, restitution looks at a community, looks at a people. It can even be a home, it can even be an individual, demanding for those items to be taken back to them as rightful owners. So the entire process is about taking back, but to whom, where, and by who, that's what creates a difference. But also restitution looks at a process, because if it's a community, then you need to look at the sense of ownership. How can a community claim? Because communities have individuals, and a community can have different sort of, it can be a Ugandan community, but a Ugandan community has so many tribes. It can be a Ganda community, but the Ganda community has so many clans and denominations. So it looks at that process of how objects can be taken back to the rightful owners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balimonsi. And I think that's very important. Barbara, we've had a conversation over lunch, but I think I just wanted to get you onto this conversation on the aspect of, now that Balimonsi says taking back ownership, taking back things to their rightful owners, what is in the middle of that, based on your understanding? What is stopping these things from coming? And are we ready as a continent or as cultural institutions or as communities to actually take on these things?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. This conversation is actually coming in at the right time, when I think as Africans, as Ugandans, we are beginning to rise up to recognize who we are and put aside what we have always been told who we are. It's not that we didn't know who we are, but the story or the narrative changed along the way during the colonial period to begin telling us who we actually are not. So coming up now to speak about who we are, what belongs to us rightfully, I think it is a step in the right direction. There are a number of reasons as to why Ugandans and even Africans at large should begin demanding and saying, hey, we need what belongs to us. First of all, as Mr. Balimonsi has said, it's all about identity. It's all about the people, the significance of these artifacts. They are not just artifacts, but they are there with a story or a narrative that exists around them. And therefore, their being taken away sort of leaves an empty context. And the artifacts are seated somewhere else now with a different narrative, while we remain here with a narrative, but without a point of reference for especially our young people to be able to connect with their past. Now, one of the reasons that these artifacts should come back, it is to help our young people, as I've just said, to reconnect with their past, with their history, so that they can learn from it and based on it to actually reconstruct and innovate for a future that is purely about them, not about what they are told they are when they actually are not. it is also about morality. It's about what is right. I might share an example. If I walked into your house and took away your cups and plates, and took away your clothing and said, hey, these are beautiful, you will not be able to keep them. And I take them away to keep them for you. But you know why you have that kanzu and the passion with which you make the kanzu to appear the way it is. So when I remain with it, I think I disenable you from linking with what is yours that helps you to express yourself as who you are. In Uganda, for example, if you walk along the road and you find a woman putting on a busuti, you will get to approximately know from which region of Uganda this person comes from. You will get to know someone putting on a suka, where they actually come from. So it is only right that I give back to you what is yours, because in any case, you even had it before I came in. So it is just right. Then also it is about collective identity and responsibility. As Ugandans, this is what defines us. But we all know that actually most of these artifacts that are out there are an inspiration to many of the people who are out there and seeing them. They are learning a lot from them. They are innovating from them. But how much does a young person here in Uganda, someone from the most remotest village who has come to Makerere, how much opportunity do you have to actually look at some of these things and innovate around them and learn from them? I think the time is now that we rise up and we learn from our own history and try to make something that is for us. But you've also asked me about the reasons why some people are hesitant. Some countries are hesitant to repatriate these commodities, these artifacts. There are a variety of reasons. One, and the biggest one, it is said that as Africans, we are not yet ready to handle these very precious items and keep them for ages. I must say that yes, to some extent they have a point. It's true. We are discussing about culture today. I think the auditorium was full in the morning, isn't it? Just take a look and see how many people are here to actually discuss what touches their own personality and identity. The museums that we have, there are very few. Mr. Balimos will tell us how many are there that are government-owned and run. But we also have efforts by some people who have put up community museums to be able to express, to showcase what the Ugandan culture is all about. The Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda has supported more than 21 community museums to actually set up and run these premises by themselves. And they have formed a consortium, an association called the Uganda Community Museums Association. So when you look at the struggles that Uganda has in terms of providing for culture, it really leaves a lot to be desired. A number of you listened to or heard about the efforts, the struggles to protect and safeguard the National Museum. It was on its way out to be demolished, and then a storage building is set up for commercial purposes. That shows the level of interest that we have in culture. And the capacities, yes, we have some people who are trained in managing museums, but I think the level of training is not yet sufficient enough. But for me, again, this provides an opportunity to begin the story now, to do the training now. The Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda, in partnership with UNESCO, started up a program to introduce a Bachelor of Heritage Studies in universities. We were lucky that 4 universities accepted to pilot this, and these universities include Chambogo University, we have IUIU, Uganda Matters University and Kampala University. We also did approach some other universities, but the level of interest, and given that this was a project, was a bit slower than the pace at which we were moving. So we actually now are in advanced stages. The course has already been accredited by the National Council for Higher Education, and hadn't it been for COVID, these courses were going to be up and running beginning this year in September. Chambogo was going to enroll the first cohort. But that, as you have said, it's true.
Yeah, so just shortly, I would like to bring in Jim into this conversation because I think you raise a point, but I would like to ask Jim. Jim, you're the co-founder of Nest Collective, and recently you participated in a TED Talk where you actually talked about this topic. Barbara says there's no capacity, or there needs to be more effort put into capacity building within our institutions to be able to actually become safe spaces where these things can be repatriated back to. But I just want to understand from you, but also she talks about the fact that we're not very much collectively interested in culture as much as we think we are. And that's why these people take advantage of that. I just want to bring you in there. Do you think we have the capacity, and do you think there's interest? And based on your TED Talk, you could share a little bit about what you think should be the approaches and steps for us to actually be ready. But also, if we are ready, then what next? Thank you.
Those are very hard questions, but I think one thing that I'd like to preface my answer with is by saying that there are two issues here. There's the issue of the logistics of movement of objects. How do you move objects back from Europe, back to Africa? And then there's the other question of justice, which is how the objects were taken, from whom they were taken from, and how do you repair the relationships that were broken in the process of that looting. I like to separate those two issues because when we combine all those issues together, then this situation becomes very difficult. The question about capacity, for instance, I think the question of capacity is a little bit artificial because the thing that we don't take into account is the fact that museums and all these cultural institutions in Europe and America, they do earn a lot of revenues from having objects and having collections. And so those revenues do go into the question of capacity because they allow museums to train their staff, they allow the museums to photograph their collections and to do all those improvements that one would call capacity. And I think it's artificial for Africans to then be asked, do you have a similar capacity when our museums have far fewer objects because of the looting, which means that it's very rare for people to want to come to Kenya, to Uganda, to Benin to visit the museums because there's not much to see. And so I don't necessarily agree with that question of capacity because I do feel like it is being used as a delaying tactic. Regarding interest, I think the fact that Africans and our relationship with our history and our culture is a little bit thin is testament to the success of the colonial project, because the colonial project was not just about taking land and property, but it was also to serve up the relationship that Africans have with their own culture so that you can then, civilize them, quotes. And so for me, it is not necessarily, I don't blame Africans for having that severed connection because it is not us who severed that connection. It was a colonial project. And then the question about I worry about how much effort Africans are spending on explaining why we want our objects and saying, oh, we need them because of culture, we need them because of our children. For me, the simple reason is because they are our things. And there shouldn't have to be many more reasons above that for the return and the repatriation and restitution to happen. I think we are putting too much effort into over-explaining the reasons why we should have our own things back. And I don't like to invest too much energy into that because it's artificial again. With regard to capacity, again, if the return of the objects is accompanied with profit sharing, for instance, on the revenues that have been generated from museum attendance, then the question about capacity becomes an easier one to answer because then you do have the resources to train new curators, to improve museum facilities, and all those things that other countries are able to do because they have stolen other people's culture. So for me, I feel like capacity is a trick question, and I don't like to engage with it seriously because it is being used politically as a delaying tactic right now.
Yeah, let me just get Balimusi into this conversation. Yeah, so because you took my thing, do I need to be ready so that you can bring it back? When we talk about capacity, when we talk about interest, the thing is acknowledging the fact that these things are not yours, right? And then putting in place preparation to actually bring them to the rightful places where they are or where they're supposed to be. Whether or not these places are ready to actually have them is a question I want to ask you, because you are the curator of Normal Gallery. As an institution, what role do you play in this conversation?
Thank you so much. As an institution, we are mandated to preserve, develop, promote, and popularize Ugandan culture. And, because we are that as a custodian of culture, I would like to give, sort of decipher what kind of objects and the statistics we are talking about. How many people have visited museums in Europe? Just raise your hand. Because some of these museums are national museums, a huge lot of the audience doesn't pay for the tickets. But on average, these museums host between 1 million to 9 million before COVID. The objects we are talking about, remember the figures. The objects we're talking about are dated between 1860s to 1950s. On average, you can say, let's take 100 years, on average. A museum ticket, on average, is about 10 euros, considering the biggest and the smallest. And when I say the kind of museums we're looking at Rijks, we're looking at Office, we're looking at Prado, Museum de Prado, we're looking at the British Museum, we're looking at some of those museums, like the British, hits up to 5.9 million people per year. And some hit up to 10, but we shall take an average of 1 million to consider even the smallest museum. Assuming 50% paid for the tickets. Let's take 2 million to simplify it, and 50% pay for the tickets, and 50 don't pay. They enter for free. Multiply that times 100 years, that is 10 times 100 times the number of the audience, which is 1 million. How much is that? When the French president gave a speech, he said 90% of Africa's objects are hosted somewhere else, outside the continent. When they released a report, France alone has close to 90,000 objects from Africa, majorly the Francophone-speaking countries. But it's not the biggest. It doesn't have the biggest collection. Belgium alone has 100 and something, which might be the biggest collection. Now I'm breaking down. Someone will say, yes, I've gone to the museum, but I've not visited any African collection. So why should you look at those figures? The museum earns money through these strategies. Public museums may not charge an entry ticket because they have a fee which is close to 60, between 50 to 60% from government to cater for the survival of that institution. However, they have a huge or an interesting program to connect the audience to the museum, which is called Legacies. Legacies is where you identify potential funders who are nationals that are interested in preserving culture. But these potential funders look at how huge or incredible the collection is for them to give that money. Remove the African collection. How big will their collection be? Remove 90,000 objects from the French collection. There are certain funders who will not come. Another program is the direct entry tickets, the gate collection. I've gone to Rijks, I've paid the ticket. I've gone to Venice, I've paid for tickets. And the highest ticket I think I've paid for is 45 euros. Single entry. I have all my tickets. I've crossed over 50 museums. And I was doing the math. So assuming only 50% pay for the entry ticket, which is 10, which is not, normally entry tickets don't even make 15% of the revenue of a museum. You people were in the morning session, which was economics. That's why I bring this economics. So even the figure we've mentioned, the calculation you've made is not 15% of the revenue of a museum. The biggest revenue is the legacies, which could be between 20 to 35% or 30. But it also depends hugely. If you're to get a patron, they largely depend on what collection you have. That's the reason why when you go to a museum, the first thing they will tell you, we have the largest collection in this country or on this continent. And sometimes they will categorize it. They'll say, we have the largest collection of small mammals in the world. Or we have the oldest foot of a human in this museum. Do you know why? Because that's what legacies pay for. So if you have an African collection, which is the biggest, that even a Uganda museum won't have, I have no reason to come to Uganda. Instead of burning that air ticket, I'll go to the museum. And if I'm a big funder, why would I fund an empty building in the Uganda museum when ideally there's a huge collection of Ugandan objects? Another revenue source, I carried this on purpose. This is just a workshop that we worked on. It's trade and merchandise. Many of you have gone to museums, you come back with key holders, things like this, bags. On average, those little items will go for between 10 to 20 euros on average. There is a percentage discount which is given to members. How many objects are sold? How many objects have you bought in a foreign museum? Or even at a Uganda museum? Calculate that and multiply with the numbers of the people. Because whoever goes to a museum wants a souvenir to relate to. And do you know why that souvenir is so expensive? It's not, there's no science, it's not rocket science. Because this is the biggest collection of mammals on the continent or in the world. That's how we do the business, as curators, as museum directors, and so on. It brings me to another docket, which is a revenue source, membership. If you check, just Google any museum, membership will be between 50 euros to 160 or 200 euros, around that. And you'll have platinum, you'll have so on and so on. Assuming you've removed all the numbers, what remains are the potential members. And in this membership, sometimes you're just given an entry pass with an extra guest, or a guided tour, or a meet and greet with special
Philip,
people.
I just want, sorry to cut you short, but I just want to understand, as an institution, knowing the dynamics and also knowing the numbers and all this, what role do you play in that space? And how are you pushing the conversation forward for us to get new approaches and new ideas for the restitution of this?
the first thing we do is to demystify these narratives, and that's what I'm doing. Because when we mention a museum, it sounds like it's a foreign thing. A museum, I think it's a Latin or Greek word that comes from museo. Museo simply means a god of memory. And in the Greek mythology, museums weren't buildings, Greek or Latin, I can't remember so well. But it was, we had human beings that were custodians of the heritage of a culture. But because it reached a point where generations couldn't adapt to the same, they decided to create a space where these people could scribe the memories, write them, and create them in that space. So that space became the museum. So when we talk about museums, don't look at me as someone who is coming from a different planet. I'm a person who manages memories and experiences. And in those memories and experiences, you're part of it. So when we say narratives, we simply mean those experiences and memories. So part of our role as a cultural institution is to demystify those narratives, is to explain them to the people, is to make these sort of big words become, tangible words that we can interpret. What is memory in Luganda or Lusoga or in your language? That's the museum. It's not this amazing building. And when my colleague talked about community museums, you're not going to find these magnificent buildings. And what we are doing, we are running a project with the Uganda Museum. It's called Museum Futures Africa. In this project, we are preparing museums to be able, one, to decipher the narratives of the existing objects before new ones come. Because there are lots of objects that have gathered dust that have those colonial texts. You reach there and it says the beginning of Uganda. Okay. But the curator was a colonialist. And you don't blame them. Because to them, that was the beginning of Uganda. Because that's when they discovered it. But who are here watching it?
Yeah, and I think you bring in a very good, interesting thought that I was actually thinking about. When we talk about a museum, and I'm bringing you, Barbara, in, when we talk about a museum, it's just a space, and you talk about a collection of memories, you talk about a collection of identity, and this is what we see happening in these museums, or rather the museums that are refusing to repatriate the objects that they have. I mean, they have memories of communities, they have identities of people, and people really want those identities. Now, I want to bring you, Barbara, into this conversation. Do you think it is only enough for us to say, okay, bring back these things and let's put them into the Uganda Museum, for instance? I know of communities that actually hold dear to some of these artifacts, and they were not just taken from the institution itself, but they were taken from real communities. So for instance, I remember because of the report that certain academics President Macron had instituted to actually, they took us certain things to Benin and all and these things were not taken just to the museum, but they brought in community people to actually demystify and help them understand what it meant to them, as communities, as people. So in terms of what Philip is talking about, do you think these things need to just go to these spaces, or they actually need to go to the communities where they were taken?
Thank you very much. I think these objects carry meaning for the people that made them. And therefore, it is very important that they are given their context. Yes, we can have community museums at different levels, but then the government should also come in to support the safeguarding, the protection of these artifacts. We know they are very valuable. They attract a lot of money, as Peter has just elaborated, but I think they are given more meaning when they rest with where their narrative is. For example, it is so much meaningful to Bunyoro Kingdom if you returned to them the Nyamyaro stool. The Nyamyaro stool is the stool that the kings of Bunyoro during coronation they had to sit on. It is a 9-legged stool. So to them, actually, now when you go to Bunyoro, they will tell you that all the misfortunes they are facing is simply because their leaders are not actually properly constituted. And therefore, for me, I would say it is important that these artifacts rest where their meaning is, within their narrative that created them.
Okay. Jim, I want to bring you in. Of course, when you talk about the capacity, we shouldn't have a conversation about capacity. We should be talking about things as they are. Do you think we've done much to actually create the awareness that it is? And as an activist in this space, how should we approach the conversation, or how should we approach the dialogue?
I think if you talk to the average African young person, old person in any African city and ask them about cultural objects, you'll find that they have an opinion about objects. And I think a lot of European academics and museum professionals are not aware that this is a very public issue for us. For them, it's a very academic issue. It's stuck within the museum circles. But for us, these losses are on a community level, they're on a family level. We have many people in Kenya who say that their things were taken away from their homes. And so the loss for us is one that we live with in a way that Europeans and Americans don't. So in terms of making the conversation more public, I think the issue is that most of us are not aware of the political issues that are making the return of objects problematic, and those issues are not here in Africa, which is me again saying that the questions about capacity, to use Barbara's example where someone steals your clothes from your house, the question of capacity then becomes Europeans wanting to come back to your house to inspect your wardrobe and see whether you have space for the clothes that they want to give you back. There is no moral context for that questioning to happen. If you've taken things, return them. Stop asking about where they're going to be put, who's going to be in charge of them. You're very right to say that, again, the museum and academic circles have captured this topic in a way that is not fair or right, because objects were not taken from museums and institutions, were taken from people. And people who made objects definitely have more use for them than people who only conserve them or move them around from temperature controlled rooms to one, So you are right that people who made objects are the ones who need them most. But there are many communities who were completely finished by colonialism, kingdoms that were broken apart, communities that have intermarried to the point where they no longer have an individual identity. And in those instances is where I can see a space for a museum to then take custody of the objects on behalf of the people, not because they are better at it or they have more knowledge, but because those people have been compromised by history. So in terms of like public debate and public knowledge, I feel like Africans are carrying too much guilt about being worthy of receiving these objects back, and I feel like that's an artificial debate.
Yeah. So, Jim, if hypothetically, if you were consulted to actually design a campaign that actually would need to sort of like get that awareness, how would you approach it and how would you message that, for instance? I just want, hypothetically, if you are put on the spotlight to be the person that actually, what would you design?
I think the narratives that are missing in public debate in Africa are about how those objects were taken. For instance, there's this ridiculous story where the Belgians have been talking about restituting the tooth that belonged to Patrice Lumumba. And I find that debate very insulting and it's very emotionally disturbing, that story, because this is a man that Belgium arranged to be shot, buried, dug up, hacked to pieces. They dissolved his remains in sulfuric acid, and anything that remained, they set it on fire. And now, all these years later, Belgium are delaying the return of a tooth. That's a very
brilliant.
That's a very difficult story.
Brilliant.
And I think those are the stories that Africans need to hear more about.
Yeah. So, in your view, we need to be intentional about our demands. We need to stop feeling that we actually owe them anything, that these are things that we actually need, we require them because they actually took them in ways that were violent, they took them in ways that they made us feel inferior of ourselves and all that. So now we've understood better and we need them back, right? That's how the messaging would be for your case. Brilliant. Of course, yes?
Maybe just to add to that, I think we would also need to prepare our younger generation to change the mindset, their attitude, and the way they look at some of these things. Take a sample of children between the ages of 12 to 18, or even take it up to young adults of up to 30 years. Talk about African artifacts. What will come to their mind immediately will be witchcraft, will be wizardry, will be things like that. But it's not their fault.
Yeah.
It's because during the colonial period, and with the use of religion and the nature of education that was brought on board, we were told that what you have is actually satanic, it's barbaric, it's bad. And what is being brought to us is what is superior, is what is good. But then on the other hand, what is thought to be barbaric is being ferried away to the houses in the greater north. Can't we think around that? We need to change the attitude and perception of our young people and even the adults, 40 years plus, to begin looking at what is our own differently. Brilliant.
Balimunsi, I know you work in a cultural institution, a gallery, and you're a very amazing curator and collector as well. But I think also, like Jim says, we need to stop being dilly-dallying around with the asks and the demands and all this stuff. And as a cultural institution, I know you work with a lot of organizations that actually support your work. Do you have these bold conversations with them and you're like, hey guys, this is actually, before we actually work on this, let's focus on making sure of this. Because basing on the conversation that is coming here, part of why we're having a deteriorating interest in culture is because we don't have things to look up to, you know. And these things are somewhere, and they're kept, and they're misrepresented. I remember when I went to Leeds, for instance, in the UK, I went to one of the museums, and I read about an artifact that I personally knew about, but it was being misrepresented, you know. I couldn't have access to it, and I know very many of us would want to have access to these properties, to these artifacts, because they embody our identity, they embody our memories, they embody who we are as a people, you know. And I just wonder, why don't you just acknowledge that we actually took these things and we need to take them back where they were supposed to be, you know? There's been a lot of demand, there's been a lot of conversation, and I feel we need to stop, the dialogue is happening, but it looks like there's a vested profit interest in these things. So it's very hard for you to just say, okay, let's let them, because, I mean, if we talk about 90% of what the British Museum could have is maybe from somewhere, if you take it away, is it a British Museum? Is it the British Museum? Does it still make sense for them to still run an institution called the British Museum? Then it becomes so different, you know. So I like what Jim says. We need to stop apologizing about what it is that we ask for, because if you took it without permission, then you have to bring it back and give it to us, because for us it matters, you know. And now I bring you Phil. You gave us very interesting numbers, and now for me the question is, with the institutions that you work with, are you very bold enough to actually tell them, before you actually fund or invest in this project, would like you to actually put more emphasis in making sure that you engage into this within your areas?
I think we are privileged, this generation is privileged to have the idea of collaboration. For me, as Africa, not only Uganda, there is a need to have a common voice. If you're a Uganda museum, what about the cultural institution next door? What about the National Museum of Kenya? What about the National Museum of Tanzania, West Africa, South Africa. I know the process of looting these objects is totally different, just as the colonial process was different. Because in some instances, it was aggressive and there were real souls that were lost. That's why you see Benin is quite aggressive when it comes to these objects. They lost human beings for these objects to be ferried. But as an institution, and as cultural institutions, now I will also speak for the Uganda Museum, we thought through this, and if you Google online, you'll find Cambridge University Museums is preparing to bring back some objects to the Uganda Museum. So this is the bold question we had with the Uganda Museum, and we are happy they invited us as stakeholders. I think CCFU is also represented by Mr. Frederick Nsibambi. This is, they invited us to rethink the museum because we want to Africanize processes of these institutions.
Yeah, because when I go to the Uganda Museum, I see a lot about speak and John something and all these people, and then I see less about our identity.
Yeah, that's the point, because most of these institutions, even if we mentioned Makerere Art Gallery and Makerere Art School, they are somehow frustrated with these collections, if they have any, and the processes that we inherited. So part of the Africanization, I hate to say decolonization, because I believe colonization is part of our legacy, a little bit. We can gentrify it, but it's that history that we can't discard. So because of that, I prefer to say Africanization of our institutions. And when I say Africanization of our institutions, is not just merely having Africans as heads of institutions, but it's a deliberate effort for African institutions to tailor content in an African-based manner and context. If you're teaching at Makerere, which languages do you use and which other languages do you promote? How much do you cover when we talk about, for example, architecture? How much do you cover when it comes to European architecture vis-a-vis Ugandan architecture in terms of history? How much do you cover in terms of European or American artists in regards to the Ugandan artists? When you study museums, how many European museums do you know vis-a-vis the Ugandan museums? How many museums have you visited as a Ugandan abroad vis-a-vis the museums you've visited in Uganda? So Africanization simply is a awakening of African consciousness to understand that the power that we are seeking for lies within us. And we are going to do a sample project. We are pulling out one of the oldest historical section of the Uganda Museum, and we just want to test with a few objects to see how people can react with these objects if a Ugandan like myself and you displayed these objects with a new narrative without dismantling or disturbing the existing narrative. Then Ugandans will make a judgment. We want to connect the existing space to an entirely new space and give that cultural experience to a Ugandan under the future, Museum Futures Africa. And we are in collaboration with close to 6 museums across Africa. And this is the new school of museology. We shouldn't look at the transcribed curriculum and end at that. As a museum, we should be able to create a new school of thought for an African sort of structured encounter where we meet and we feel the experience in an African sense, and we carry that experience as a verbal conversation that we can transfer from generation to generations, because we are orators naturally.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And I think this is where I bring in the audience to contribute to the conversation. We'd like to hear from you if you have any questions, if you have any ideas, comments that could contribute to the conversation. I'm open to 4 of them, and I hope we have a microphone to move around. Do we? Okay, so I'll start with someone here. The microphone is there, so we'll have you to take it on. Boss, him.
Thank you. For me, because most of my work is to do with intellectual property, my name is Kea Nicholas. I am an artist who also learned that I did not like school because school was lying to me. So I started to look for books that made much more sense to me. Eventually I realized my name is Nicholas and I did not like that. And I came across things like give a dog a good name if you want the dog to be a good dog. I think what they did was to give us a bad name, and then they changed our narrative of what our name is, plus our artifacts, and in an attempt to erase who and what we know about ourselves. So yes, I think it's right, we should not be apologetic at all, but in terms of guilt, that is unfortunately a cultural legacy for us. And I agree with the gentleman over there by saying, yes, it is impossible to decolonize because it is part of who you are. In fact, you should never forget that.
Thank you very much. We'll have someone over there. Okay, there's a lady with the mic. Yes, take it on.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to first introduce myself. I'm called Namgobe Vicky. I'm a youth leader representing the youth of Sironko to the National Youth Council. Yes, as the Secretary of Female Affairs. So I just wanted to make a on what has been said. Really, this issue of repatriating or bringing back our cultural objects is a pertinent issue because we have a belief that with the coming of globalization, our cultures have been eroded away. Supposed to be. We have lost our identities and we have lost the spirit of patriotism. Now, as about the challenges and about the benefits that other people are benefiting on us as a continent, like we find our cultural objects are out in museums and they are benefiting, but us who were the authors of these are not benefiting at all. I would like to put a call out maybe to the government later on that can we come up with policies that can be able, like he has given us one of an advantage that some country has accepted to bring back our cultural objects. So if the cultural objects are coming back, can we find a policy or a framework that can be able to protect these cultural objects so that if they are protected, it could also promote local tourism, and we find that we ourselves are participating in the local tourism sector and we are encouraging our young generation to be able to find back their roots and to be able to be patriotic in their country. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. I think policy making is important because then there's a clear roadmap of how this should be handled. I'll have him, but then I'm just having two people after that, yes. Okay, so let's have her and then you come after that.
So I'll introduce myself. My name is Kim Sebuliva Nachimera Babola. It's a long name. I am an events planner. And my question is to the lady on the stage. You had said something about us not being ready. I don't think if I took your clothes, there's ever a good time to give them back. I think the same should be said for African artifacts. I think the same should be said for African culture. I think the same should be said for everything that was taken. I feel the reason why this conversation is even happening about if, when, I don't know if you guys are ready, is because no one wants to take responsibility for what they did. No one wants to say sorry. So the longer they pull this on, hopefully at some point, we'll just say, okay, fine, just give us our stuff. Yeah. There is a penalty to pay, financially.
Yeah. And I think also one of the recommendations in SAR's report, one of the ladies that was part of the steering committee for President Macron to put together a report that actually talks about why we actually need to bring back these things. There was an issue of equity and international mutual working together, because in such a space where we are, I remember someone talked about globalization, there's the principle of equity and the morality. Like, I mean, we can't keep holding on to a history that is not ours. People are woke now, we need to get them their things, and let's keep mending relations. You answer that, but let's have that.
I want to start by recognizing the gentleman seated the other side so much for his symbolism in his dress code. That is very, very interesting. I'm really very humbled as a Pan-Africanist. You're bringing the true identity of our heritage and what we ought to sell to the public and the whole globe at large. The lady here talked about coming up with courses in public universities that look at promoting African culture. What I really need to say is that the most important thing, the initial work that Africa ought to do, is to demystify the mind of young people who are coming up in the globe or in the global space. I've interacted with a number of people who actually, feel shy calling themselves using the African names. Just a week ago, I was talking to a gentleman from the Department of Journalism and Communication, and he told me never to call him Wesonga. He's a man from the land of Bamasawa. He told me never to call him Wesonga, but I should call him Steve. I told him, gentleman, get serious. You're called Wesonga, this is your identity, and the whole thing is because such people do not actually have the information, they don't know their identity, they don't understand their background and heritage. So it is a great task for African cultural institutions like where he comes from to demystify, come up with projects in public universities, engage the young generation to appreciate African culture. Because if they don't appreciate it, then whatever we're trying to do at the later stage when they're already grown up will just be a sort of waste of time. So it should start from the background level. People's minds should be demystified. Thank you so much for the latitude.
Thank you so much. I see there's a lot of engagement in this conversation. So I'll have the lady over there. The lady over there, yes.
Kagoya Asina, Youth Councillor from Bujiri Municipality. We are talking about the issue of reinstitution of African cultural properties from colonial times. But then, Mr. Moderator, how are we going to deal with the issue of these colonialists coming back to Africa in form of investors, hence interfering with the African cultures? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think Jim will answer that one.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Titus Ugutu, young lawyer. So my comment is that I think we also need to learn. We shouldn't pretend that we do not understand our history. We live in a country that has so many youth at a point, and it's funny that actually our elders are the ones actually telling us some of these things. So we have been talking about mindset change. So, and in the morning, someone actually clearly stated it that we do not have shortcuts to development. So one of the things I am saying is that yes, these colonialists, or wherever the way people would want to call them, that they took these artifacts. Okay, fine. So when they come back, then what? Because definitely there is going to be a group that will even not see any value when these artifacts are actually brought back to Africa. Okay? Some of them will clearly say, so what are we going to use them for? So I think one of the things that needs to be put in place, one, is that as we claim to have them back, let's also think of new ideologies. What are the new things that can we put in place? My sister clearly talked about...
Thank you very much. I think we just need to get...
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm Kennedy Award. I'm a lawyer by profession. I'm a human rights activist. I would like to really appreciate the gentleman over there for what he has said. More so, I would like to bring back history. In Europe itself, it happened. We see what Napoleon did when he invaded most parts of Europe. He was stealing our treasures. And when he was taken away in around 1856, those things were returned back. But from the legal aspect, I would like to bring the international law position on some of these things. Some of these things are, okay, they are talking about repatriation, but some of those things are irreparable. It's like a Munyankole who has lost a cow that he loves so much. You can't pay it back with money. It's the cow he or she loves. So we, the Africans, need those things back. We are lost in culture. How do I talk about it? We are lost in naming, we are lost with food, and we are lost with dressings. There's a woman that named the child Ashavin. Ashavin was an Arsenal player. Took the kid for baptism. The priest asked, what's the name of the child? Ashavin was like, do you even know the meaning of Ashavin? That's a Russian name. So we're giving ourselves names that are even so hard for our grandmothers to pronounce. So what is the thing? We need to stand back ourselves and be who we are. Let's embrace MDD in school. I don't see music, dance, and drama anymore the way it used to be. Let Makerere and UCU compete in MDD. Who wins should be recognized. The local culture should be encouraged. Let's have African dressings. I see people modeling, but they're modeling with European clothes. What does it mean to us? We're leaving away our old African clothes. So let's find a way of putting Africa first and our dress code first. We name our child Yoweri Museveni Kagota, it's okay. That's a name which is not English, it's fine. Let's find a way of having those names so that we hold the value to ourselves. There's a lot more to do, and we need to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have the gentleman over there.
Thank you so much for the brilliant discussion. I'd like to ask the following 3 questions. How do we decolonize our own African museums? I'd like to give the example of the Uganda Museum. At the moment, there is an exhibit in which the human remains of the god of Wochiwuka are displayed. That exhibit has his jawbone, his umbilical cord, and his genitals, and they're currently on display in the Uganda Museum. My name is Waswa, and I'm a Muganda man, and I come from the clan. The Chiwuka exhibit at the Uganda Museum currently has the human remains of the god of Wochiwuka. I come from the clan. I come from the clan which traditionally supplies the priesthood for Jaja Chiwuka. Do I have the authority to ask for those items back so that they can be worshipped as they rightly should be? My second question is.
I think the answer is yes. Yes, you should demand for them.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope the Uganda Museum can do that. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge currently have a lot of sacred objects from Buganda in their possession. They have the drum of Jaja Dungu and the shields of Jaja Kawumpuli, for example. Are we ready to have those items back? Personally, I am, but won't there be mass protest with, as she said, people thinking that is witchcraft? And thank you. For background info, I have a website I'm building called Return the Twins, and it talks about the twins of the Kabakas, which are currently held in the museums of Oxford and Cambridge. Those are their umbilical cords. Please check it out. It launches tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I think you've already started, and we need more people like you who are already on the journey of recovery in terms of demanding, in terms of putting in place initiatives that sort of like seek to find new ideas and knowledge into this. So I'm just having the gentleman over here, and then we close the questions. Thank you very much. But let's just have, then we can close also the Okay, take it on.
Good afternoon. My name is Kajina Ishak. I'm so humbled to not have any name in English. So a round of applause to my parents. So where I do industrial art in Chambogo University, and we have had problems with our intellectual property. We are talking about artifacts that are abroad, but you will find that the Act 3 says when work is original to the person who worked about it. And now we are talking about people who have been having our works for all these years. Don't you think we are going to have a problem where they have the patent law and partly we have ours? That is where my concern is. And to Madame Barbara, we have been talking about innovation and renovation of when they bring this to us, we can do something like, let's say, where I come from, we have grass-thatched houses, but architectures here have not done anything from them. We are only seeing 2-3 houses that are from that round house. So that means we have failed to have the source of inspiration from even the artifacts we are thinking of. Now, we even have problems of where we have siblings where we have gone to birthday parties and people appreciate Spider-Man wear, the masks. But these masks come from Ghana, they come from Uganda. Are we going to get them back and still renovate? Or the white man is giving you back what is now important to you, but they have already gotten what they want. Because things have been worked on and they have renovated very much from what they are going to give you. So how are we going to get this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand that this is a very triggering topic as well. So I know most of you are really interested to contribute to the conversation, but unfortunately, because of time, we'll have another session. I hope the organizers of this conference can maybe put together a session where we can come up with ideas, but I'll just bring in the panel to respond to your queries shortly. You just have 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to be very clear that when I talked about lack of capacity, I didn't mean that we are completely at zero, and it doesn't mean that we do not have the right to demand. But rather, if someone points out something that you actually need to do, and it can help you to better safeguard, I think it's important, as you demand, you work around it to be able to properly take care of these items. We support community museums, but I can testify to you the number of community museums we have supported, and some of them have failed to take on. And for me, I'm speaking from experience. And I'm saying little by little, as we build our own capacity, we should also demand, it's what belongs to us, but let's also put our house in order. Secondly, I appreciate the role that education plays in demystifying. We cannot downplay the Bachelor of Cultural Heritage degree that we are setting up. We cannot underestimate the advocacy efforts we've put in to make sure that what is Ugandan is included in our curriculum in secondary schools and primary schools. All those are beginning points. How much do we have that pertains our own culture as compared to the content that is from outside? That's where the whole indoctrination is taking place. And simply because within our families, we have failed to actually play the role of transmitting this knowledge and information to children due to a variety of reasons, including the economic change and the likes. We need to use multi-pronged approaches to demystify information about African heritage. I also appreciate, finally, the role of the importance of narratives and how they are put, as well as the need for a legislative environment that is protecting and enhancing, safeguarding what is our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Balimusi.
Thank you so much. I want to go direct to policies because I come from a government entity. Government has listened, and if you have your ears to the ground, they have introduced a new national development planning methodology, which is the NDP3. I don't know how many of you know about it. The program is, it's a program-based approach, call it PIAP, and it's not going to be sectors. You don't look at the education sector, the health sector, you're going to look at programs. And one of the biggest programs is the community mobilization and mindset change. So lots of resources are geared towards change of mindset of Ugandans, most especially the youth. And it's going to be run by so many sectors. So then to the gentleman that asked about an opportunity to request for objects, a national museum is guided by policies, acts, and documents of that nature, or policy manuals and so on. So when they collect objects, they cease to be individual objects. They become national treasures. And there is a clear process of how someone can request to loan or to use a national treasure. So you just need to go and meet the museum practitioners. They will take you through the policy manuals and the details. But it's a national treasure and you're part of that. Then finally, I wanted to say something related to someone who says, I have no English name or foreign name. I'm holding a book by Africa My Music. This is an autobiography by Skia Mpahalere. That's the right sort of pronunciation from the South African articulation. He was one of, after a conference like this in 1962, he was one of those Africans who decided to remove Ezekiel to become a skier. The same to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he is James Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya. The same to Philip Elimonjao. So he's called Elimonjao. So it's not something that is starting today. If you look for the identity debates, you'll find that discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether we still have Jim, but Jim, your final remarks?
It seems as if all the people who remain behind are the warriors who are really necessary to unpack this situation. We have a lot of shared history, and it's really interesting to hear the Ugandan perspective on this question, because the problems you're facing are the same, the institutional problems are the same, the culture and government issues are the same, and I feel like it's so important for us as African countries to start to collaborate around these issues, because we are facing the same issues, we have the same anger at a shared history, but because we are asking these questions separately, we are much easier to ignore. The one thing I'll just finish by saying is that culture, as the moderator said, culture is memory and is identity. And if you know who you are, it is far easier to defend your dignity from a place of self-knowledge. And so it is far easier to say no to investors who are bringing money and problematic industries into your country. It is far easier for you to say no to the school that is lying to you, to the museum that considers history as only when the Europeans came and when they left, and to the place from which you're able to say that you Europeans and you Americans, you don't want to say that you're sorry for what you did, and you don't want to admit that you're wrong. Culture is where all these questions begin, and so everyone in the room asking those difficult questions, you are absolutely on the right track. And from here in Nairobi, I'm just saying it's amazing to hear you people, and it's amazing to be joined with you on this channel.
All right, thank you very much to the amazing illustrious panel. Thank you very much to the amazing audience that really giving amazing insights. Thank you so much to the consortium that organized this conference. We need more of this, and we hope we can continue in the move to decolonize museums and keep demanding for what is rightfully ours. I've been Wabire Joseph Ian, the moderator today, and I hope we can catch up later. Thank you very much, and see you.
I've been part of the panel that was discussing restitution of African artifacts to Africa, to the African continent. I think this is really a very big debate. It's interesting, and it should be debated now. And the African artifacts should be repatriated, because that's where they actually belong. The whole narrative is here. One of the things that may rise as a question is about who actually now will own these artifacts once they are brought back. These are state treasures, these are national treasures, and we are one Uganda. And this brings in the importance of collaboration and working together. So I think for me, what it needs to be done is for the cultural institutions whose artifacts are out, working together with the state and putting in place preparations for actually ensuring that these artifacts remain a treasure and a legacy to our country, that we have these brought back, put in the national treasury, but then recognize the institutions, cultural institutions where they actually belong, and allow those communities to be the ones to provide the narrative that is accurate and speaks to what they are all about. The conditions that must be in place: one, we must have the spaces ready where to put them. Because if they are not protected, given that they are treasures, indeed they will be stolen and we will lose it all. Secondly, the places where they have to be protected against fires. Recently, the museum in Congo went up in blazes. So I must say that we need to make sure that we have protected against all risks in places where we are to put these artifacts. And finally, there should be laws and policies in place that will actually protect vandalizing these artifacts and ensuring that they benefit the whole of Uganda and not just the communities from which they belong, because they're already now at that level of a national treasure.